I'm Josh Cooperman, and this is Convo by Design, with a follow-up conversation. Last November, I sat with Joshua Dawson, a film director, and Rachel Joy Victor, designer, strategist, and world builder. This is a follow-up to that conversation, which was a truly detailed chat about artificial intelligence and the rapidly developing uses. And you know what? It's not that scary. Scary is relative, right? But when you talk about AI, everyone just seems to be really afraid of it, unless they're the type that want to use it to take advantage of it. But some might be afraid of the machines taking over the world, while others might fear a deepfake of themselves more. Regardless, fear isn't going to slow this tidal wave of machine learning. It's not. What can affect it is education, standards, and practical application of this new technology to accomplish much needing attention with a pulled focus on the design industry. Issues like data management, human adaptation to new tech, credit and attribution issues in media, protection of intellectual property, workforce, economy, business growth, and activism. This is a complex topic, and complex issues require complex solutions, right? That's why we're continuing to have these conversations, like this one, recorded in April of 2024. We'll get to that right after this. I am just incredibly proud of this partnership I've got with Thermosol. They have been presenting partners of Convo by Design going on 5 years now. And there is a certain amount of pride that comes with saying that the show is presented by the company that is the best in the world at what they do. Thermosol engineers the most exceptional smart shower products and steam shower systems worldwide, full stop. And it's for a few reasons. First of all, they were the first company to design and patent the technology here in the United States, dating back to 1958. Thermosol, a U.S.-based manufacturer based in Round Rock, Texas, employs an engineering team that designs, tests, and continuously refines the product. Their quality control team tests every single steam generator before it departs the factory. Who else does that? Nobody that I know of. I have the pleasure of working with some world-class designers and architects who tell me, and if you're in the business, you know this, that the idea of luxury has changed, especially when clients want a spa-like bathroom. Steam is mandatory, or it's just not considered a luxury. And if you want to add steam, you have only one true option, my opinion, and that's Thermosol. Mitch Altman, third-generation CEO of this family-owned company of 65 years, continues to innovate in the bathroom and shower space through technological marvels such as intelligent showering systems, sound therapy, aromatherapy, technical interfaces, and so much more. And now Thermosol, the industry leader in steam bath equipment and technology since 1958, as I mentioned, is enhancing its already stellar family of products with the new indoor and outdoor luxury saunas available in 3 designs. The configurations are absolutely amazing, and you should probably go check them out. Indoor and outdoor options. It's amazing. You really do need to check them out. Go to thermosol.com or at Thermosol on the socials. So as a follow-up to so first of all, I have gotten so many comments on our conversation from West Edge last November. It's been crazy. So thank you again for doing it. Hopefully you saw the video and listened to the podcast. Did you guys like it? Did you learn anything that you didn't remember, or were you reminded of anything that you said or that you heard that was impactful?
I did. I thought that one of the things that we sort of touched upon toward the end was, like the idea of how artificial intelligence is sort of training on, like the bad habits, right, that we've established as architects and designers. And then, but I was also starting to think about how that kind of is an interesting comment to make because like we don't know what good design is. You know, we haven't really understood what that definition is. So how do I know if it's training on bad habits? So I went down this whole sort of rabbit hole of thinking about that and playing that out in my head. So that was the most interesting thing I thought, post conversation.
Yeah, I think relatedly, it's also we were talking about like what is the data being trained on, right? And there's this thing of like, especially with spatial design, a lot of the visual and image models are trained on 2D data, so it doesn't necessarily have that 3D understanding. So that's been interesting to think about, I think, in the interim between the November conversation, because OpenAI, they've not publicly released it, but they've shown images of Sora, which has been trained on a lot more, it appears to be trained on much more like spatially aware, kind of like physics engine maybe created um, data. So it has more of that 3D kind of brought into a space that didn't really have it before. So it kind of comes back to that data set of like, if we can keep making that data set better, how do we define better? And then how do we, does it help us get closer to achieving the type of results we want?
It's so true. And I started telling you, excuse me, I started telling you a little story about, so I was walking my dog and I was thinking about our conversation. I was listening to Bloomberg and they were talking about Tesla and their next generation of driverless cars, specifically for taxis and that sort of thing. And I was thinking back to a, another life ago when I was hosting this show called The Green Detective, like in the aughts, 2006, 2007. And I met an actress named Alexandra Paul who was on Baywatch, and she's really cool. And she started doing a couple episodes of the show, and we started talking. And I was introduced to some of the folks from General Motors who worked on the EV1 program. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the EV1, but basically here's the most amazing electric vehicles ever made at the time. They were the first ones made. General Motors made them, and basically the program was so successful that they destroyed it. They produced, I want to say it was like 300 vehicles with regenerative braking, fully auto, fully electric, just amazing. They're beating Corvettes off the line, and it was crazy because what they did is they produced this small batch of vehicles and they leased them. They didn't sell them. So they leased them out to actors and actresses and athletes and musicians. Ed Begley Jr. is notorious for having his. And this is pre-social media, right? So nobody's posting pictures of them driving down Ventura Boulevard in their EV1, right? They're just, occasionally there's some news coverage. But what happened is General Motors like had this uh-oh moment where they're thinking, wait a minute, we just produced the best vehicle on the planet that people aren't going to want to trade up on in 3 years. This vehicle could last 10 years. It could last 20. The batteries need to be changed out, but that's it. Everything else is amazing on these things. And so basically they collected them all and they flattened them and they destroyed them. There's images. If you go look at this, it's crazy. You can see pictures of like a Nevada desert where they have these vehicles just stacked on top of each other and they just crushed them. So I think there's one at the Peterson Automotive Museum. And I think there's maybe one or two. I'm sure that there's a couple in private collections that you'll never see because there's someone's private collection. They'll drive on a track, but they won't take it on the street. But the point is, they created this amazing product, no data set to speak of, because they didn't keep the data. They completely destroyed it. And it got me thinking, isn't it amazing where we are in the automotive industry now, where it's like they're trickling into innovation? And I'm going to say it's a bit provocative, but in my work with Playboy, there was some exposure to the adult industry, and it's the porn industry adapts to things immediately. they're actually one of the biggest innovators on the planet. They'll try new things out. It'll fail. Nobody does it. It works. You see it. You see it mainstream. Nobody talks about it. Like, hey, General Motors or McDonald's, they're not saying, hey, we got this idea from the porn industry. They're not saying that. But what's interesting is it goes back to your idea of data set collecting. And I'm just curious, between November and now, so we're recording this in April, how do you think about data collection, not industry specific, but as it relates to, because the industry is changing so fast, how do you stay on top of it, and how has it changed in the mere months since we last spoke?
I can start with that.
You should go, Rachel.
Okay. So I think part of it is, as I mentioned, with like Sora coming out, right? Like we live in a world that's able to be more 3D in terms of capture. I think that's a big kind of turning point, right? If we're thinking about trying to accurately represent the world, and we I think we talked about this a little bit in November. One of the challenges with AI as being like an accurate representation of human intelligence is that it's starting from a different data set, right? It's starting from a different starting point from what humans are starting with, right? Our sensory input is very different from the types of ways that reality is represented in the data that then makes that then uh, artificial intelligence forms its conclusions on, right? So like one example of that is our world is 3D, where we have like a 3D experience, an embodied experience of the world, but a lot of the content that has been fed into these systems is 2D. So now I think we're starting to see this turning point of like, okay, how can we, at least on the side of 2D versus 3D, we're not representing other sensation necessarily. There's not smell or taste that's part of these systems, but at least let's try to represent vision more accurately and in a way that's more representative of reality. So I think where we're seeing things like obviously more like 3D game engine data being fed into the data sets, that's one thing. I think with the release of something like Apple Vision Pro, one of the hopes is that the longer term vision of that is not just about having 3D experiences, but because it's a mixed reality headset, it needs to know the surrounding environment, and it's capturing 3D data in a way that a lot of other devices haven't had the chance to before. So I think we're seeing in the data side that turning point definitely of, okay, at least for this one sensation, vision, which is so important to how we see the world, how can we have a slightly more accurate version of that representation of reality? And I think, yeah, stuff like NERFs, neural radiance fields, or Gaussian splats, if you've heard of those kind of technologies, they're also kind of, I think, part of that movement.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, like what Rachel was saying, this sort of spatial data being captured, we don't know what it's capturing, and then we're not necessarily sure who is sort of like sifting through that data and then kind of using it to train their models, et cetera, right? And I think that's definitely one side of the conversation. I think that there's also publicly available data, right? I think that there's GIS data, there's geospatial information that governments and cities, et cetera, are collecting. And oftentimes they make it open source in the hope that, people have a better understanding of how they're viewing the city now and how they're engaging with the city. And I think I am always sort of interested in how that's being manipulated, right? I'm interested in how a lot of the data that's being collected by companies like IBM and Google are being used by big oil and fossil fuel companies to end up kind of creating these machine learning models to find the best places for extraction of oil, right? And that is something that's so vastly different from how that same technology, right, and the same method of training on data can be done by using parcels of land that are available in the city for developers to build on and to exploit for maximum profit, right? I think it's safe to say that majority of the built environment now is predominantly not necessarily being designed, by architects, right? I think they're mostly being designed by developers, and it's being and builders, and it's this sort of ability to take square footage exploit FAR, exploit zoning regulation, and milk the most amount of profit from it is interesting. So the more they've been able to do that over the years, they're able to kind of collect all of that data and then eventually find what the best way for them to make profit off of the city is, which eventually leaves less space for building kind of 15-minute community neighborhoods or complete community neighborhoods, or for making sure that people who are temporarily unhoused are able to find accommodation. And I think that there's all sorts of problems that this goes into. And I think that I know we're sort of talking about data, but it's about how we're making sense of the data. That's kind of becoming a lot more important at this point in time. And also consent when it comes to the data, right? Like, are you allowed to have your Roomba that's running in my house, or are you allowed to have Apple Vision Pro sort of scan my place, but, sort of take that data and see how I live and see my personal space, and then, what are you doing with that, right? And I think that those are interesting ethical questions that we always sort of need to keep in the back of our heads, because I think over a period of time, words like privacy have certainly changed, right? Like, what was considered privacy 10 years ago is very different now. And I think the same way, I think the word consent is also sort of changing. So yeah, that's
I
sort of
think
what I was
also
thinking.
tying that part to something that you were saying, Josh, with the General Motors story, there's this idea within that of like planned obsolescence, right? That when we talk about technology, technology nowadays is designed to ideally have like a 2-year lifespan, right? That like the performance starts dwindling after 2 years. Like it could stay better for longer, but the idea is that you would trade it in, you get the next one, you pay more money instead of having a device that lasts with you for a long time. And it speaks to something which is like these choices are encoded into the technology by the creators, right? It's not something that's inherent in the property of the materials. It's not like the materials themselves stop working after 2 years. It's something that's kind of built into some of these chips, right? And I think we see a similar thing when we're talking about AI. There are all these parameters built into data. There are all these things that are built into these data systems that aren't inherent necessarily to the data, but it's the creators, the developers who are working with the data are making these choices. And one thing about AI is there's so much automation, right? It's making our lives potentially easier by making some choices for us, but those choices have some values built into them. And so the question then becomes like, which of those choices do we actually opt into? Are we aware of the design values that are being built into them? Are those the ones that we want to stand for? And then I think building off of what you were saying, Joshua, it made me think about how those choices then start affecting the real world, right? About like which data do we want to see? How do we advocate for ourselves? There's an interesting thing kind of happening in Barcelona, which has a lot of tourism going through it, which can be good for the city to a certain extent, but can start affecting people's lives who actually live there. So there's this one bus route, Route 160, and that locals were getting really upset about because it kept getting clogged by tourists and it would take forever for them to get home from work. So they actually put in a petition and they got Google and Apple Maps to remove that bus from the route. Like, so the bus is still running, but in the digital version of things that these platforms that people are seeing, if they come onto the platform, if they're tourists, they're not seeing it as an option. So then the locals who know how to ride the bus and like are familiar with it can take advantage of it, right? But not necessarily people who are using this digital platform solely as their way to navigate reality, right? So we're seeing all of these like kind of trade-offs of like who's making these choices, who has ownership, who has authorship, and like who's deciding at the end of the day, right? There's a lot of gray areas right now.
Yeah,
So
like, are you just, no, I was just gonna say, like, when you buy a new product or you subscribe to a new app, you don't necessarily read the terms and conditions. You just click accept and you don't know what it's taking from that. And yeah, it's just funny. Sorry, Josh.
Joshua, it is so funny. It's like you're reading my mind, dude. Seriously, because what I was going to do, I was going to come back and say terms and conditions. And I'm curious because by the way, we're recording this on Zoom. So video for YouTube and social, audio for the podcast. One of the things that I love about Zoom is they introduced their AI assistant with their AI companion in the summary. And I have been using that like crazy, because what it does is it'll basically break down our conversation into easily consumable bits and bytes and chunks. And I love that. And so I started thinking about TNCs, right? And that is one of the positives that I see, is being able, basically, in what we're talking about, being able to take something like a terms and conditions and break it down into 20 sentences. Here are the rights you're giving away, just so you know. Here's what you're agreeing to. And I think that will change the nature of one industry for sure. Love the idea, though, Rachel, about removing a certain bus line from the digital version. It got me thinking. So I'm in Tulsa. You guys are still in the Los Angeles area. And when Waze first came out, it destroyed every one of my epic shortcuts.
Oh,
just
no.
obliterated, just killed it. La Cienega Boulevard is crowded because of Waze. That is the ultimate, that was the shortcut, that was the cut through to everywhere. And basically that just funneled everyone in. And I think it's an interesting idea, because I feel like we're in the midst of that now. Does everything in the world of AI boil down to just a series of Venn diagrams? Is that really what it all comes down to?
It's funny you mentioned that. Have you heard of I think it's called the paperclip maximizer. Have you heard of this, Rachel? I don't remember. We probably didn't speak about it in the last conversation, but it's about, I think Nick Bostrom, he had this kind of analogy of, if you own a paper factory, right, and you want to maximize the production of paper clips, right, you design this sort of AI that does that for you. So the AI says, all right, I'm going to study your supply chain, and I'm going to figure out how to make the most, how to bring you the most, how to make sure that you're making the most amount of paper clips. So what it ends up doing is it studies and analyzes the workings of the business. It starts to first, and in the very beginning, it starts to produce more paper clips, right? Like, it finds the efficiencies. It makes sure that, the system is sort of tuned to optimal requirements. And eventually that's really great for the company. It's really great for the market share that they kind of have. And then all of a sudden it starts going a little bit further, right? It starts becoming more intelligent. It starts finding ways to end up buying all other paperclip companies. It ends up finding a way to make sure that, majority of the workforce is gone. It kicks out the CEO and it starts taking on the role of the CEO. It starts buying up metal companies. It starts buying up mines. It starts using products that have iron, and it starts like recycling them to make sure that it's making more paper clips, leaving no other objects available for humans. And then eventually it starts taking iron from humans, right? And it kind of makes the entire world is this giant paperclip making factory, right? And then it eventually ends up building this paperclip rocket, moves to different planets, colonizes different planets, and then it just this giant, paperclip universe that we live in, right? And I think that is an interesting thought experiment, because you can apply that to basically any company that's kind of unguarded, because it comes back to the question of why. Why are we building so many buildings in the world? Why are we extracting so much oil? We've somehow lost sight of the goal in a way, right? And when growth is the sole sort of driver of most of these companies these days, you kind of start to wonder, where they lost their way. It's like Netflix kind of saying, we're going to be the next cable, or you can cut your cord, you just have to pay $15 a month and we'll make sure we have everything for you. And now all of a sudden, what did they do? They start doing exactly what all of these, cable companies are doing. And it's the same thing. It's kind of an interesting, analogy of, kind of making sure that why your company exists in the marketplace. And I think that's basically what it is. So coming back to this sort of question that you asked about the Venn diagram, I think that is sort of the Venn diagram in a way, right? Like, it's just trying to kind of expand at nobody's business, and then, not necessarily asking for consent, and just we need to make sure that we have the kind of right regulatory kind of frameworks in place to avoid this from happening in a way, if that makes sense.
You are listening to my conversation with Joshua Dawson and Rachel Joy Victor. We're talking AI, and we'll be right back. Man, I love this. I have a new sponsor partner on the show that I want to introduce you to if you're not already familiar with them. If you are a specifying designer, architect, landscape architect, or savvy design enthusiast, if you have heard about the quiet luxury movement, this idea of crafting a lifestyle around understated elegance, simplicity, and sophistication, there's more to it than that. And I will add uncomplicated living. Isn't that what we all strive for? I am extremely happy. I'm really thrilled to share a company that embodies all of this, utilizing proprietary technology and a focus on sustainability in their stunningly beautiful products. It's TimberTech. TimberTech is the premium decking company delivering multi-tonal, color blending, and natural wood textures in a product that is virtually indistinguishable from a natural wood product. What does this mean? It means it's everything wood should be. A beautiful look that blends seamlessly with a well-designed space, providing years of enjoyment and performs the way you want it to. No splintering, fading, peeling, cracking, or rotting. I had a wood deck at our Manhattan Beach home, and I gotta tell you, it was exasperating every year doing the random board flip, taking out nails, resetting them, restaining them. It was a complete pain. It was complicated, and I didn't look forward to it. I wish I had TimberTech, because TimberTech is not only uncomplicated, it's beautiful. It comes in over 20 finish options and 9 collections, and 85% of the material is recycled. This is premium decking for your next project. Learn more and specify it for your next design project. TimberTech on the socials or timbertech.com, where you can find a retailer near you, as well as a number of tools to create, design, order samples, and get the expert help you may need. TimberTech is uncomplicated luxury and performs. It's your choice for your next deck project.
Design Hardware's newly remodeled showroom is where you will find a gallery-style space with a thoughtful display of products, purposefully positioned to allow unbridled exploration and discovery. High-end faucets, luxury tile, natural stone, wood floors, and bespoke hardware selections are presented in a holistic manner, strategically arranged to stimulate creativity and transition your vision from the conceptual stage to a fully realized space. Conveniently located, free parking available. Stop by to find your inspiration. Collect samples, get expert advice, and tackle everything on your shopping list all in one place. Visit them online at designhardware.com or in the real world, 6053 West 3rd Street in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to like the fact that I think regulatory frameworks on one hand, but the other hand is like cultural frameworks of like how are we actually thinking about where these tools should be adopted and how they should be used. Like there are definitely a large amount of cases nowadays where I will see content that I know is like, okay, I can see the ChatGPT influence on this content, right? In terms of how this is written, in terms of how this is organized. And again, it leans into that maximizing idea of like, oh great, like with ChatGPT, I can do write 10 times as much content as I would otherwise. But then it comes to that question of like, what are we maximizing for? Is it good content? Like, the issue when you're taking content like wholesale from ChatGPT. I'm not saying it can't be a good tool and a good resource, but ChatGPT doesn't have that, overarching logic. It'll repeat points, or it won't necessarily have the information architecture, aligned in a really great way. Or, it's not necessarily targeted to the type of project that you're trying to do in the way that you could when you know all the nuances of it, right? All of those things they can lead to a maximizing, but also lead to this kind of things deviating to the mean, things coming towards the average, right? Because all of these systems are designed towards, what is the average? What is the high probability answer for this question? And maybe, leading to less uniqueness. So then to the point of what you were saying, Joshua, around maximization, it's like, yeah, we could be creating more content than ever. All of these studios I talk to nowadays are like, in the near future, we could push a button and make a whole movie. And I'm like, great, but it wasn't a movie you'd want to watch. If we're talking about buildings or design and interior design, like, sure, you can generate all of these things, but are they things that you'd want to have in your home? Is this what you'd want your buildings to look like, right? There's some of that intentionality that gets lost when we lean into the maximization piece without having that forethought that goes into it.
But do we as humans then sort of change our value systems to accommodate for it? I feel like that's what we're doing right now, right? Like, I think that in that sort of paperclip world, I think humans are resilient enough to sort of defend themselves from that in some way. And I think that there's some sort of like value judgment that we would probably have to make. I see you nodding, Josh.
Well, let me give you a real world example. And I say that you say you think that we're smart enough to defend against it. I wish I was as optimistic as you are in that regard. I'm just not. I think that the people will gravitate like the water principle. You know, it is the path of least resistance. You will go to the easiest path that's possible. And I will give you an example. So recently, I did a whole episode. Architectural Digest produced a project for the actress Sofia Vergara. And I don't know if you saw her home in AD or if you saw the video. Beautiful. Yeah. And in the original article, one designer, O'Hara Davies Gaetano, got the credit for the project. Joshua, you're nodding. Did you read? Do you know the story?
No.
Okay.
But I'm.
So O'Hara Davies Gaetano and her firm got credit for the project. Timothy Corrigan, who's a friend and an absolutely exquisite designer, who has been around for a very long time. He's epic. He's amazing. He was like, wait a minute. I worked on that project for years, not months, years. And if you look at what was produced, and you can see it online in the digital version, you can see it on YouTube in the videos. It's like, I did that. And it was extraordinary. The magazine came out. Nobody said a word about it until Timothy Corrigan had his lawyers write a letter to AD saying, hey, no, not cool. So huge kerfuffle in the industry. And by the way, I have since been told from some other friends of mine that there were other participants, other professionals who participated in this project, who to this day have since not been credited for their work on the project.
Interesting.
So it got me thinking about our conversation and sort of what we were talking about. And here's how I see it. And do me a favor, poke holes in this all day long, but here's how I see it. If nobody says a word, even now, because the magazine was published, in a decade from now, when a model is being produced about architecture and design for the stars, whatever, right? And it comes to this particular story, depending on the version of the story that the model uses, will dictate whether or not those other creatives like Tim and his firm or others are credited with work on the project. Why is that important? Because it's attribution, it's credit. Imagine if you're a programmer and that is your stock and trade and you don't get credited for what you do. Imagine if you're Sofia Vergara and you're in a movie and it doesn't show up on IMDb or it doesn't show up in your credits. That's a problem. And so this is not a paperclip factory taking over the world kind of thing and taking iron out of humans to, it's not Soylent Green that we're talking about, but it's like, it's an issue. It's a professional issue. It's potentially a financial issue. It's a credit and reputation issue. Where's the fix on something like that? Because I mean, am I wrong? In 10 years, depending on the model and depending on the source, there could be no credit or attribution.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that, but I'm wondering if it's an interesting conversation, right? Like, because on some level, design, the best design in the world, right? Like, doesn't have someone credited to it, right? Like, whether it's your street signs, your ubiquitous street signs, whether it's your freeways, whatever, what have you, right? Like, there's I think a wide range when it comes to sort of credit and attribution. These sort of models that are training on existing people's work, the kind of lawsuits, the way the lawsuits are playing out right now with respect to ChatGPT and Midjourney and, Sarah Silverman, for example, she sued ChatGPT because it's able to reproduce her entire book, right? And it's clear that it's sort of scanned her book and it's trained itself on her book. And I think that their argument is that training is very different from copying, right? Like you train students on the work of the past, right? The same way they have trained their digital model on the work of the past. And I think that that is where they're trying to have that issue. But I do understand what you're trying to say about, like the fact that oftentimes we generally like to attribute one person. I'm not sure if the Timothy Corrigan thing was a misattribution or if it was just a failure to attribute him and he was one of the many designers on the project. But similar to that is the sort of Donald Judd piece, which is, the Kim Kardashian, Donald Judd issue, which is basically she had, I think it was a fake Donald Judd.
It was
right?
it was a complete dupe.
Okay.
Complete dupe. Yeah.
That's incredible. And then she said that that's a Donald Judd piece, and then his estate kind of sued her for it, right? And I think that there is, which comes back to this sort of thing that I was talking about, where you're using law, you're using the kind of legal frameworks that we have to sort of defend the work of creators, defend the work of artists, because if we don't have rules and laws in place to do that, then obviously it's going to be, this sort of dog-eat-dog situation, right? It comes down to the paperclip. And I think that it's really important that we protect copyright. It's really important that we protect patenting. And I think it's like almost a call to action. I'm always sort of saying, the government needs to get on this now and fast before this sort of spins out of control. I do like the fact that Instagram has started to say, okay, now we're exploring this idea of Midjourney art that exists being attributed to, just saying that this has been created by AI. A24 came under fire just yesterday because, for their new movie promotion, they ended up using artificial intelligence to sort of generate posters as opposed to hiring a concept artist. As an independent studio at a time like this, where so many artists don't have work in the industry, it's important that they're able to sort of lead the charge on this, which is what they did during SAG-AFTRA negotiations and things like that, right? Like, so I think that it's sort of important that we're kind of working hand in hand with these, with regulation in a way, and with legal, with whatever legal frameworks are available to us. I also think that I don't want to go down this route, but there's a lot of conversation happening right now in architecture about unionization, right? Like making sure that architects form unions, interior designers form unions, because that's something that can eventually protect our role, our title in the industry from being kind of devalued in a way, right? Like, and it makes sure that you're bringing about a form of legitimacy to whoever is kind of becoming a part of this union, and then you have union protections. And then when the union protections, I think where the WGA and the SAG where they were kind of falling apart was because they didn't work hand in hand with the government. But we have licensure, we have these sort of rules and regulations in place to do that in a way. So I think that it's more beneficial to us than it is for them. Sorry, I know I kind of deviated a little bit, but I think it sort of speaks to what you were talking about. Hopefully.
No, I think it's relevant. I think what you were saying around like sometimes with design it's hard to attribute, right? Like especially in like world building projects, if it's systems design, you're trying to like synthesize a variety of inputs. You're trying to bring as many point of views into the conversation and then make them part of one cohesive whole. So it's hard to be like, this specific idea came from this person, right? And to trace things back. I think that's the argument that legally a lot of these companies like Stability are making around their models. They're like, humans are just generally pattern recognition machines. We're just doing that at scale. Like we learn from experience. These models are learning from experience. And I think that argument's like slightly disingenuous, right? Like we're pattern recognition machines, but that's kind of modulated through our our brains and our emotions, right? That add another layer to it in a way that AI doesn't necessarily do. We have imperfect memory, right? Those things all feed into our ability to like properly copy or pull from something directly versus these tools, especially depending on the size of a data set. They can sometimes like replicate things very closely. Like there's the Getty Images lawsuit where these models were like, we didn't train on Getty Images. And then Getty was like, you definitely did, because if you look for sports images, they come with, you know, a ghostly image of the Getty watermark. So there's obviously data that's in there, right? So all of these things become kind of, you as a creator, as someone who's then seeing your work used, right? Because a lot of people, and I'll even play around with this on Midjourney. You can put in specific creators' work and be like, I want this to be done in the style of David Hockney, right? Or I want this to look like this other artist. All of these kind of people that you can build very similar kind of aesthetics to. So then it becomes, as a creator, how am I making sure there's compensation for me as a part of this? Or how am I making sure that I'm also preserving what I am as a brand, right? Of like, if it gets diluted to we were talking about the dupes, right? Like if the story of who I am and what it means to be a piece created by me gets diluted by these engines, who's responsible? And I think a lot of these are gray areas. And unfortunately, I think maybe the legal side is moving faster, but just the broader like legislative regulatory side is moving really, really slowly in this space. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of like, I love this idea of humans are forgetful. Like, I love that because it kind of reminded me of this quote I read by this poet. It said, creativity is the space between remembering and forgetting. So sort of any creative act requires you to forget in order to create. And I love that.
Well, it's interesting because there is, you know, I've been digging deep into this whole concept of dupes, and there's a website now, of course, dedicated to dupes. And so if you see like this, we talked about the Donald Judd dining set, right, in the Kim Kardashian office. You can put in a prompt for that particular set, and then you'll get a whole list of duplicates that you can purchase elsewhere that are slightly modified, right? That's what kind of scares me, though. Scared is a relative word. That's what concerns me a great deal about this. Like, I started doing what I do. I cover what I cover because I love architects and designers. I love what they do. I think as a creative, seeing what other creatives can think of and imagine and create, it's just remarkable to me. You know, world building is something that I'm just fascinated by because so many details go into it, and to be able to create a whole world out of ideas is just amazing to me. So the thought of there being a place where you can go to figure out how to usurp the intellectual property of a creator to go get it for a little bit cheaper, or if you're somebody that makes things, to look at something and say, wow, that's really cool. I'm going to change it by 10%, or I'm going to change it by 30%, and then I'm cool. Well, you're not, because there is no law of 30%. That doesn't exist, even though you can talk to people who will quote it all day long. Like, well, as long as I changed it by 30%, then I'm good. That is so not true. But
that's true. Yeah.
The problem is our intellectual property laws are opaque and obscure and outdated, outmoded. If you're studying law today, intellectual property law is a completely separate entity unto itself, where you have to learn about copyright and infringement. And, you know, a lot of people think, well, as long as I slap a C on it, or I put an R on it, or I put a TM on it, or that I'm covered. You're not. It means you took an extra step while you were typing something, but it doesn't mean that you've actually done anything about it. You have to protect your work. You know, protecting your intellectual property rights, that's a choice. I'm wondering, because now everyone's talking about rules, regulations, standards, guidelines. Have you seen that get any better?
On the regulation side of things? I think it's gotten worse. I think it's going to get worse for a little bit longer, at
Really?
least. Yeah. So like an example of this is it's because we're dealing in general with this changing view of content, right? And like content being a commodity, right? So especially like if you look at Google results even, right? It used to be like, okay, at least the first page of results would be good. Now, if you look at Google results, in addition to their, AI synthesized headline at the top, a lot of the other like first 5 to 10 sources are themselves websites that are basically AI mishmashes of like the top answers around that thing that you're searching for, right? And I think it's going to be harder to distinguish from your 2 or 3 levels down with like AI content, right? So it is, as an example of this, one of the few tools that was like starting to actually use generative AI at scale was Adobe, because they were able to be like, okay, we train our models on Adobe stock images, which we know we have the rights to, and we already had that in our contracts with the creators, and they knew that it could be used for something like this. So we're able to now use generative fill and all of these other things that are part of their image tools. But one of the things that's come up is within Adobe stock, people are now uploading Midjourney generated images as their images. So it's like technically it's a generated image is feeding into this thing which you have ownership of. What does that mean in the attribution piece of things, right? So I think we're already in this gray area that's going to get even grayer as we start to see this like, okay, you created this originally, and the thing that you pulled from, or like you pulled from a lot of different sources, maybe, but this piece of what you did was generated, or two versions ago, this thing that you drew from had a generated element. So like, how are we going to deal with the implications at that point, right? Especially if we're talking about like percentages. At that point, it might be like, yeah, you revised it enough times that it's different, but also, yeah, is it just a percentage thing? Like, how do we actually start to quantify what it means to be like different enough?
It's that's so funny because I was putting together a pitch deck recently, and I was trying to look through Adobe stock and the number of Midjourney images, and they expect me to pay for those images. That's the annoying part, and because they want like license, like they want
Yeah.
attribution, right? And that's just so funny. But yeah, I completely agree with Rachel. I think it's going to get a lot worse. I don't know what it's going to take for people to start realizing that, this is important. But in the same way, I think that it's also maybe in a good way, kind of bringing it back to what is authentic creation. I think that that question of what is good design, what is good art, I think that people are starting to collectively, start having these conversations now. What constitutes a ripoff, essentially? And I think that my wife, she's the kind of design manager at Craft Contemporary Museum, which is located right across the street from LACMA. And she was telling me that there's this sudden increase in interest in handcrafted kind of artwork, just because people are so sick and tired already of all of the digital kind of, fakery they're seeing online and all of the Midjourney stuff. They just need a sort of break from that, and they want to go into a tiny craft museum that's, just handcrafted stuff where a bunch of artists are just, doing something they love and they're passionate about, and they're passionate about the process of doing it, right? And I think that that's something that, in a way, is sort of good. I think, at least. So yeah.
Yeah, I will say off of that, like on a more optimistic note, from saying that, like, yeah, the regulation is going to get harder. We talked about like, are people, when we were talking about the commoditization of content, we were like, is it going to get better? Is it going to get worse? I think we're going to see it get worse, but I think to what Josh was saying, it'll get better at a certain point, right? We see this in a lot of different fields, right? Like when there becomes the ability to create content in a cheaper way, companies definitely are like, oh great, I can fire a whole department and do this with 2 people instead of 10 people. Sign me up, and then there's this overcorrection of like, yeah, let's do that. And then they realize like, oh, in the process I lost my brand voice, I lost what made me unique, and now I sound like every other company, or like it's just a lot of content out there, but there's nothing that like makes people stay, right? There's no stickiness to it, right? And then there's kind of a correction a little bit to be like, okay, let's find a middle ground. And I think we're going to see that again with AI kind of content as well, as yeah, people are going to lean into this, are going to lean into it, but then there's something soulless at a certain point with just having like
Yeah.
I'm not saying like generated content is like it has to be inherently soulless, but there's a certain style that you can see if you with a kind of baseline of images that is like uber perfect, uber symmetrical, or like all of these things, and you're just like, yeah, but it's boring, right? It doesn't have a vision behind it. I think that's where we'll lean into what people are calling like the taste economy, right? Like where do you actually have a story to tell? Do you actually have a point of view coming into using the tool that then you use the tool as an extension of your thought instead of just letting it kind of do the thinking for you? Those types of things will start to stand out.
Oh my God, the fact that we're using the word content so much just to kind of like as a sort of umbrella term for all art is already kind of like
I'm
it's
sorry. I'm
already
sorry.
really dystopian, right? And I think that and I think that this kind of comes back. I mean, this conversation is happening a lot now. It wasn't happening like a few years ago, like Martin Scorsese, like calling out Marvel and saying, no, my films are films, they're not movies, right? Like I think that there's something interesting about the fact that Silicon Valley has used that word content, right? Like that's where it's coming from. It's just this ability to say, no, 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 you're a content creator in the year 2024, irrespective of what your profession is. If you look at Kelly Wersler's Instagram page, right? Like her work is really beautiful, but if you're looking at it, it's predominantly content, right? Like it's predominantly those images are what makes her kind of get the same sort of reach that Architectural Digest itself would get, right? And where exactly is the algorithm the kind of new curator, right? Like, are they the new tastemakers in a way of saying this is sort of where this is sort of headed, where taste is headed, where we get to decide what is art and what isn't. Oh, who knows? It's an interesting kind of rabbit hole to go
Well,
down.
well, here's the thing, and I think that's interesting. I like going down that road because in a country that is credited for the creation of avocado green, harvest gold, and the pet rock, I think that art is in the eye of the beholder. It is what you make of it. It is the uniqueness of it is what makes it special. The fact that everything in life is a series of it's a whiplash. It's a response to something else. We live in a very, very responsive society now, and have for quite some time. I think technology is directly responsible for that because everything became ubiquitous. Content has gone the way of Kleenex. You know,
Yeah.
it is facial tissue. It is content. It is because everything is. And so now you've seen, at least in design, you've seen this, like you're talking about, Joshua, with this response to craft and handmade, heart and hand, this idea that somebody with their hands made an item, made an object, and you can't find one like that anywhere else. It might be close, it might be similar, but it's only one. It's one of one. And I love that idea and I love that concept. How does that how does that fit into an AI world where the technology by design, and the overuse of the Venn diagram is designed to take everything towards the middle and most popular?
Well, I think part of it is that everything is getting homogenized because everything is just kind of falling under um, a similar category in terms of it used to be like this is a gaming thing versus this is a film thing versus this is a book thing, right? But now they're all just kind of converging because they're all just trying to compete for the same type of thing, which is attention, right? So it's just like we have a limited number of hours. Which of the things is going to be like shoveled down our throat, right? And I think that's where it relates to what Joshua was talking about with regards to like the algorithm, right? Like if we are able to strip everything of its uniqueness in terms of format, then we can just say like everything uh is something that could be consumable within this easy package of something that you just keep scrolling through. Um, I think the one thing that is able to sidetrack from that is when we lean into less of thinking of attention and thinking more about experience, right? Like when we're talking about Kelly Wearstler, like the reason that it's content is because it's trying to scale. The people who are actually having the experience are the people who have that design in their home and get to experience it, right? For them, it's something more than content. For them, it's something that's part of their lifestyle at that point, right? So I think it's leaning into what are the things that pull us away from experiencing things just at this base layer of content and finding things that take us a level deeper, that are more sensory, that are more embodied. And that means that there are going to be fewer of the things, but then those things can be more distinct.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also sort of thinking about, at what phase of the kind of production spectrum AI often fits into, right? And initially I used to think, okay, at what point do you want to start using AI within your process of design, right? Like, do you use it right from the beginning where you're designing the brief and trying to figure out the narrative of the concept? Or are you using it right at the end when you're ready to sort of like pitch it to news publications, right? And I think I think most of it right now, the way I'm looking at it, is an everything everywhere all at once kind of approach, right? Like where people are like, no, I'm going to use AI at this phase. I'm going to use AI to test and optimize. I'm going to use AI to produce. So I think that it's left up to the individual artists. I'm not someone who says don't use AI at all. I think it's really helpful. I think there's a lot of efficiency that it can bring. I'm just sort of like I'm very curious as to, like you were saying, intent, and asking the question sort of like why, right? Like, okay, if something is being produced, how do you make sure the why of it is addressed before it's actually being produced? And I think that is fundamental to all form of kind of content or production, right? And I think that if the sort of central sort of thematic narrative of the project that you're producing is lost, then it has no meaning. So if you're someone who's producing Midjourney images just to make sure that you're getting more followers on Instagram, then I think that, like that's your why, right? The art form isn't the image. The art form is the hustle of actually working the algorithm of Instagram. That's an art, right? Like, so I think it's important that we're able to identify what the art is in all of this.
Yeah.
But it's not. But the Midjourney image shouldn't be a piece of art in itself. It shouldn't be in MoMA. And I think that's. But the process of doing that certainly should be documented and put into MoMA, because that's a remarkable feat, right? And I think that is sort of where I'm at right now with how I view this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be hypocritical of me to say like I'm against AI, right? This is not meant to say like AI in general is bad. I mean, I work with AI. The company I co-founded, Fabric AI, we're working on developing AI tools that can kind of come alongside the creator to kind of help on the efficiency side of things, right? But I think it comes down to, like you're saying, Joshua, like what is the role it plays in the process? Like if I talk to a lot of AI filmmakers or just, people that are really trying to lead into using generative video as a part of their process, they will often be like, oh, I don't, the traditional process is you write a script, then you like, find your shots, then you like are filming, you're in production, blah, blah, blah. They're like, yeah, I don't come into it with a script necessarily. Like I come into it with a general idea of what I want to say, then I see what the engine gives me, and then I work from there, right? So there's this new kind of modality of workflow that's emerging that is in conversation with the engine. And I think some of it comes down to, but how much of that within it is there's something to be said for having, whether or not it's good. Like sometimes there are filmmakers who have like really crazy visions of things that they want to make, and then they see it all the way through. They're like, I have had this like idea that's burned into my head. I'm going to make it happen. And there is something interesting with this new workflow about dialogue with an engine, but there's also something interesting about those who come into a process that are like, this is 100% what I want to create, and I'm not going to rest until that image, that frame that I saw in my head is exactly like how I saw it in my head in the real world.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And, the one thing that we can guarantee is that the moment one thinks they're on top of it, it's going to completely change. I was reading an article the other day. It was an design industry website. And the article, I don't remember the exact title, but it was basically Has AI functionality reached its peak in the design industry? I started laughing just audibly because it's to even ask the question is so ridiculous. We're in the top half of the very first inning. I mean, we're at the very beginning of the beginning. I don't even think we've come close to exiting the beginning of the beginning yet. It's just until it becomes completely integrated in everything that we do. And I feel like it has to some degree, but it's going to continue. If you had to predict until we speak again in a couple of months, if you had to predict what you're going to see next, what you're using most, how it has changed for you, and how you think it's going to change in the work that you do, what would you say those changes would be?
I think the changes at this point, I always say, like when we're talking about AI, there's kind of a gradient of where the change can happen, right? It can be the model itself changes and evolves, or the application layer, the integration layer becomes more ubiquitous, right? So I think there's definitely research that's happening on the model side and things that need to be solved. But I think the big thing that we're going to see this year is more things on the integration level. Like if you look at what Adobe just released with Adobe Premiere, there's going to be generative extend, object removal, object addition, right? Which to do in a video level is infinitely harder than to do in a image level, like where it was before. And they're talking about integration also within the tool later this year, like Pico Labs and Runway and Sora and all these other kind of video tools. So I think that integration level is going to be pushed much further this year. And that just leads to increased adoption. That leads to, when it's in a tool context, people are able to see where it fits within their workflow. And that lets it go much further.
Yeah, I think, what Rachel's saying about this we talked about that a little bit in our last podcast, this idea of, these kind of AI plugins, just very organically integrating with your workflow, and you don't even realize that an AI has actually helped you with your lasso tool in Photoshop, right? I think I think that that's sort of going to be the future, where, like right now it's a little bit jarring the way AI stitches into your workflows and your processes. I think in the future, it's just going to become really seamless. And I think that all of the people that are sort of, talking about how AI is stealing jobs and AI is this and AI is that, like, I think one of the things that we don't talk about is the fact that it's not going to happen in the way that we're thinking it's going to happen, where there's going to be this sort of like pivot moment. It's going to be very slow and it's going to be very sneaky, and you're not going to know. The very same people that are kind of like fighting it right now are going to realize that AI has like suddenly just folded into their life, right? And I think, for me, if you ask me where I'm most excited to use AI right now, it's research, right? Like, I think when it comes to doing world building, when it comes to sort of setting up a world, what AI is able to give you, what ChatGPT is able to give you, is you ask it a question, you're having a conversation with it, and you're able to sort of brainstorm with it. I kind of like that a little bit, because as opposed to having to sift through nonsense on Google, who has done nothing, by the way, to make a search easier for anyone. I think it's going to help being like an extremely helpful research buddy, and I'm very, very excited about that.
Well, final thought on my end. It was really interesting watching the news a little bit and getting up to speed. And I don't know if you've noticed this too, but the conversation of the 4-day work week has gotten louder.
It's reached a fever pitch.
What's that?
It's reached a fever pitch.
Yeah, it has. And I have heard a connection to, well, AI is going to lead to less hours needing to be worked. So a 4-day work week is plausible in that regard. They don't realize that, well, that means you're going to be paid for 4 days a week. This idea of paying people for 5 days a week when you're working 4 days a week. But what it's also going to do, and you talk about this idea of world building, is what do you do now if you have a 3-day weekend versus a 2-day weekend? Well, you're probably going to be eating out more. So more restaurants, you're going to be doing more recreational things, which, you have to have. I don't know. Do people still go to tanning salons? I don't know if that's a thing, but you need more of them if you got more free time. You need more of these other types of businesses that would operate on a 2-day a week basis and interstitially through the week. But it's interesting to see, well, there's this effect, this butterfly effect, that you change one small thing and down the line, it changes everything else. That has to, final thoughts, that has to be kind of exciting for you.
Yeah, I think from a world building perspective, it's all about the second and third order consequences of anything, right? So with AI, we're seeing a lot of that, right? There are things we can't fully plan for or fully know. But I think one of the things when we talk about jobs, everyone assumes like it's a zero-sum game of like there's a level of desire for work or for production. And if AI makes it more efficient, suddenly like you need much fewer people. But all of these things also change and increase over time, right? The desire for like amount of content kind of continues to increase at a crazy speed. And some of what we're seeing with AI tools is it's really serving to kind of meet that demand of like people want this much content. Now we have tools that can maybe help us reach that. So I think it's when we think about the implications of all of these things, we always need to be thinking on like a systems level to really understand how the context itself is changing, even as AI, like works within it. It's not a static field.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing for me is the fact that we're sort of thinking about new economic models, new frameworks for governments to have to sort of like understand what their citizens want. I think that is, Andrew Yang used to talk so much about universal basic income for that purpose, right? Like the idea that eventually all of us need to be paid the same amount. We all need the basic amounts of healthcare. We need the basic amounts. Those are not questions that can be up for debate. Like we can't give one group of people in society less benefits in the healthcare space than the other, right? I think future of work, which should probably be our next podcast episode, should I think that there's interesting things to think about that. What is the meaning of work? Does work, where does it fit into our Maslow's hierarchy of needs at this point? Does that sort of flip, right? And I think that those are interesting questions that we're all going to, I think, have to collectively answer at some point.
I will also say really quickly, I think you should check out what Joshua mentioned earlier as the paperclip maximizer kind of narrative. Another narrative to check out that's speculative and future oriented is something actually done by, I believe, SB Nation years ago called 17776. So which talks about what the future looks like in the year 17,776, where robots do all the work, and it talks about what does life mean in that context. And in this world, everyone just plays football. They play variations of football, and it brings people together. There's a competitive element, but it's a nice way to think about, okay, how do we start redefining what value is, in the future, which I think is going to be a big part of the AI conversation.
I love that. Okay, so that's what we're talking about next time.
Okay.
Awesome. Sounds like a plan.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh.
As a busy professional designer, you know how important it is to find the right partnerships. Partnerships that allow you to specify the right products for every project. Professionals like you don't just have time to sit around and waste, right? So let me tell you about one of my partnerships. Pacific Sales is here to serve you with expert, knowledgeable, and non-commissioned professionals to help you specify the right product for all your projects. Non-commissioned. That means their only incentive is your satisfaction. Pacific Sales Kitchen and Home, a Best Buy company, has just that, with over 60 years of service in Southern California. Pacific Sales is your destination for exploration, advice, and inspiration. And you will find all your favorite brands, like Monogram, and their commitment to providing exceptional products, starting with materials. Monogram sources commercial-grade stainless steel on their refrigerators, unscratchable sapphire glass on their cooktop knobs, durable marine-grade bearings on their dishwasher racks. Monogram takes inspiration from the leading-edge materials used in the high-end automotive and aeronautics industry to provide you with lasting beauty and exceptional quality. The beauty is backed by the same level of attention to performance, which is why Monogram appliances are trusted and sought after by chefs all over the country. Chain-driven French oven doors that can be opened with one hand. and an industry-exclusive hearth oven that allows for all-electric indoor brick oven-style cooking without the need for external ventilation. These are just a few of the things that make Monogram so special. Pacific Sales features Monogram appliances, and Pacific Sales Kitchen and Home team is here to help you and offer their Pro Rewards program, which is a trade program unlike any you have experienced before. And here's the cherry on top, access. Access to exclusive builder trade incentives from top brands like Monogram. Visit a Pacific Sales showroom today to learn how you can unlock additional savings and benefits. Don't miss out on the opportunity to work with the best of the best. Visit Pacific Sales Kitchen and Home today and elevate your projects to new heights. Pacific Sales Kitchen and Home, where excellence meets expertise. Thank you, Joshua and Rachel. This was our second conversation, and each time we talk, these issues seem, a bit more manageable. Funny how that works. Thank you to my partner sponsors, Thermosol, Pacific Sales, TimberTech, Monogram, and Design Hardware. These partners are amazing companies, all who have made a concerted effort to support the design community through education, incentives, events, media, and exposure for you, not to mention a collection of extraordinary products and services to match. Check the show notes for links to each of them so you can see firsthand how they make your design business thrive and your projects exceed expectations. Thank you for listening, downloading, subscribing, and sharing the show with your friends and colleagues. Thank you for your emails, show, and guest suggestions. Please keep them coming. I absolutely love them. Convo by Design at outlook.com and on Instagram at Convo by Design with an X. Until next episode, thanks for listening. Be well and take today first.